Okay, so I've done the exact same analysis with what you just saw in Excel with Midwest ISO. I did the same thing on the PJM and the New England ISO markets. I'm just showing the particular graphs and the data tables at the end of it in this case. So in PJM, I had one extra year, so I have 2006 in here now. And much like Midwest ISO, you're seeing the 07 and 08 OTC contracts being the clear front runners of the bunch. 06 is kind of split in the gap in the middle. 09 and 2010 are, again, the dogs of the bunch. They're trading at the lowest levels. And this is for off-peak again on PJM. At the actual ISO itself, it's, again, quite convoluted just because the volatility of the daily prices is, as everyone knows, all over the place. Now, if we look at the peak prices, we're seeing the exact same scenario with 07, 08 being the highest, 06 split in the gap, 09 and 2010 being the lowest. So we're, right there we're seeing that at least for Midwest and PJM, they're behaving the same. We're seeing 07, 08 being the highest, 09, 2010 being lower, and we don't have data for MISO on 2006, but I would expect that to operate very similarly right down the middle between them. So now to the data table with the prices again. Again, this is where I'm identifying if there's been a divergence. And this is, I guess, a good point to note that for years that are not in red in this particular case are years that I didn't identify as a divergence. And that's kind of outside the analysis that I did. I didn't look at why those years are closer than other years, or why the off-peak is close and the on-peak is not close. I'm just looking at I just want to identify if there's a divergence. What's the settlement price? What could be driving that settlement? So in PJM, we're seeing divergence a little more frequently than when we were in Midwest. We saw it 2 times in Midwest over the last 4 years. We're seeing it 5 separate times in the PJM market. For the peak in 2007, peak and off-peak in 2008, and off-peak in 2009. Again, if we just take any one of these examples, so in 2008, the peak prices on the 10th of February was $82.29. The realized float was $62.41. So again, about a $20 discrepancy between. We're already a third of the way through the month. But yet the contract sells for $77.44, which in itself is interesting. Just an important point to note down here that this is seen for both peak and off-peak contracts. So kind of as we've looked at it so far, we can't tell that this divergence is only causing peak contracts to kind of act oddly, or off-peak contracts to act oddly. It's peak contracts and off-peak contracts that are both acting very similarly when this occurs. It doesn't matter on the ISO, and we're going to see the exact same thing once we jump into the New England as well. So again, here's the ranking system. OTC, or the peak and off-peak, again, are 100% unanimous. When one's the highest, the other one follows suit. Temperature, again, by no means I'm not saying temperature doesn't play effect in electricity prices, because it clearly does. But in terms of when we're looking at a whole entire month average of temperature, it doesn't map up as highly correlated as I would have expected. And a natural gas price, based on the particular February contract that I was using, I just can't see anything that suggests that these particular OTC contracts are being driven by the fuel cost. But lo and behold, the S&P, my macro indicator, maps up almost perfectly again here. So again, 2007 matches up, 2008 matches up. The 2s on top match the 2 on the bottom. 2006 matches up. Remember that we don't have any prices for 2011 yet. So this 3 is really operating more like this 4. So these are 3s together. This 5 is operating more like the 4. So this is a discrepancy that we're seeing. 5th highest contract settle for 2010, but it was 4th highest in the S&P finished 4th highest. So it's a little bit of a discrepancy. But if we go back and look at the prices, the 2009 and 2010 contracts settled within 10 cents of one another. So it's almost a coin flip. It's very close in terms of the settlements in those. So we jump onto the Mass Hub, and I could almost have copied the graphs from PJM or Midwest ISO and pasted them onto the New England because they look almost identical. 07, 08 again top, 06 down the center, 09 and 2010 lowest. Same thing for off-peak, so we're seeing, pretty much the exact same story. Again, the ISO prices much more volatile than what we're seeing with the actual balance of month contract, which you would expect. Jump down into the particular data table. So one point to note here, in 2006 and 2007, we have these divided by zero errors from Excel, and that's just because we're using the SMD data from the New England ISO, which started sometime between February of 07 and February of 08, and I didn't want to backfill to the older New England data, so I just didn't want to maybe create some false positives within the system at all, so I just wanted to keep everything as consistent as possible going forward, so I just decided not to include data from those two particular years. Again, we're seeing this large discrepancy in 08, and again, both peak and off-peak contracts, so pretty much the same story through and through. So on to the ranking system, and again, almost a mirror image of what we've seen for the other two ISOs. The ones line up, the twos line up. Again, the 2011 3 is operating more like the 2006 4, so the threes line up, the fours line up, and the fives line up. It's quite incredible how this macro indicator is so heavily correlated with these OTC contracts. So, that kind of wraps up the analysis that I did with all the, the small confines that I worked with in the data that I grabbed and what I, brought into the particular analysis. Now I'm going to kind of jump into conclusions, and we'll wrap up with some questions at the very end here. So my first question that I set out this webinar to answer was, do spikes or troughs, or I guess I should say, do divergences in the peak or off-peak averages in the first 10 days of February affect the settlement of the BALMO contracts? And based on the three locations, I've seen little evidence to suggest a divergence in these two particular prices having an effect on the settlement of the ICE contract. And I kind of left it at that. I didn't really want to go in to figure out, why this divergence occurred, why this divergence occurred, why it didn't occur. I just identified it as something happened here. I didn't go in and look at, loads and generation plants going down. I didn't take any of that into account in this particular study, but by all means, you could do that if you wanted to take it a step further. Lastly, we've seen it happen throughout three ISOs in the Eastern Interconnect. We've seen it happen on, peak averages, off-peak averages. So there's nothing to suggest that, there's some bias happening in one particular ISO relative to the other two that's causing this, or that there's something that happens during the day that's not happening at night that's causing, this thing to particularly occur or operate as it is. So that kind of brought me to the next question is, okay, so, what may be driving this price? Like, what could have happened here aside from, all the stuff that happens on the grid? So I looked at the Fed NYMEX nat gas contract, and I saw little relevance. Again, that could have been my own error. Maybe I should have taken a strip average there or something. I don't know. I just chose to take the particular February contract under the assumption that people are taking gas in February and generating power buying the February contract, taking delivery in February while generating gas with that delivery that they're getting. Secondly, we looked at average monthly temperatures. We saw that it had a moderate effect that's, based on the ranking system that I built. Some of it had an effect. Some cases it didn't have an effect. That could just be because, if you look at the grand scheme of things, if you take the average temperature for a whole entire month, they're all, operate relatively close to one another within, I'd say a degree or two. So maybe it was just, again, it could have been my error with my ranking system. Maybe I need to break it down more granularly. But the particular analysis that I did didn't suggest that temperature was the complete driving factor. But what I found, which was most interesting, which actually added secondly, was this macro, what I call my macro indicator, or the close of the S&P, which surprisingly mapped on nearly perfectly, except for that one instance in PJM where the particular contract settled with like a 10-cent difference, had a near perfect correlation in this study, which, I mean, it just, everything about it is interesting, because most people, when they think about, what's driving power, or what's driving these balance of month prices, what's driving these, the power prices that are fueling in my house, they never really take into account that, maybe there's some larger macro type thing that could be semi-setting these prices, as opposed to like all the stuff on the grid. Maybe people are taking a little bit, going to the analysis a little too deep, looking for all these different little tiny points throughout the grid, which definitely have an effect when you look at, maybe a 5-minute price or a 1-hour price. But when you span that out and look at a whole entire month, maybe they have a less of an effect than one would think, and definitely than what I thought, because I was not expecting this to have any correlation at all. So I've kind of highlighted throughout, I drew my box in the sand of everything that I brought into this model, and of course, we could spend 2 years adding more stuff to this model to build it out. So there's just a couple other things that just came right to the top of my head that would be interesting to look at. One of them being transmission congestion. Secondly, we could look for large generator outages. So if, whether it be a planned or unplanned, if a 3,000 megawatt generator goes offline for whatever reason, is that a driver? Maybe in 2008 there was, in each particular region, there was a monster generator that was offline, which is causing this big divergence, and maybe it came online halfway through the month. I don't know. Secondly, with Val-day contracts, I thought it could be interesting using the same type of analysis on a Val-day contract. Instead of using these hourly prices and looking at over the course of a month, we could look at 5-minute prices and look at over the course of a day. Just a little bit of a background. A Val-day contract operates the exact same way as a Val-month contract, except it settles at the end of each day. So instead of looking at how stuff does throughout the at the end of every day and kind of average that for a whole entire month, you look at how something does every 5-minute interval that the LM or ISOs post their LMP prices, and figure out how the particular contract works throughout the day. And we could go in again and look at temperatures every 5 minutes and run averages on that. You could see how you could almost do the exact same study with the Val-day contracts as you could with the Val-month contracts. Lastly, I didn't take into account load of the region. I just operated under the assumption that it's fairly consistent temperature in each one of these regions year over year. It might vary by a few degrees, but the monthly load is relatively similar, considering a large amount of the load anyways is a baseline just from businesses and so forth. There's also a couple things just with the model itself, not necessarily drivers of what might cause these prices, but I'd use an extremely small sample size based on the number of OTC contracts. Again, I've only looked at ICE. We could have looked at OTC contracts in the UK. We could have looked at OTC contracts in Europe. We could have looked at OTC contracts on NYMEX and see if they all operated the same way as these particular ones are operating themselves. Lastly is the good old correlation versus causation kind of argument that is quite easy to find yourself getting into. So, we saw that the macro prices of what I consider macro maps on nearly perfectly to the particular OTC contracts, but I'm not suggesting that that's what's causing it. I'm just saying that they're highly correlated. You probably have to do more analysis to, kind of give a concrete answer like, one is causing the other. You can make the assumption that maybe the utilities are, smarter than one would think, and they're setting their LMP, or they're, setting their generation costs, or they're taking their profits when the economy is really good, and they dampen their profits when the economy is not quite so good. So we're seeing the particular OTC contracts and just the general prices themselves fluctuate with the economy quite closely. But again, it could operate the exact opposite way. it was kind of out of the confines of what I did in this particular analysis.